And so, if, as an anti-realist, if you're going to say that like none of this exists, and you enter like postmodernism, you legit become like a postmodern neo-Marxist. Now, I don't want to meme you, man.
I am going to meme Vaush, because that clip was taken from a video called The Debate That Vaush Doesn't Want You to See, in which Vaush's fundamental philosophical worldview is challenged by Lewis from Perspective Philosophy. And over the course of this video, I'm going to show you clips from that debate, from Vaush's streams, and from a variety of other sources, including Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. Sorry. And together we're going to break down Vaush's fundamental philosophical worldview and explain how it directly affects his behavior.
She's clean and not stinky because we bathed her last night.
His relationship to the online left community.
Because you're so triggered by the left!
Why so many people on the left hate him, and why, ultimately, he's going to have to take an enlightened centrist arc like his former master Destiny, or inevitably implode. And to be clear and upfront, I genuinely do like Vaush, and I know there are people who think that he is way too far left-wing, and I certainly understand that, and I disagree with him on a lot, obviously. But I think he is genuinely funny a lot of the time, and very intelligent, and most importantly, and unlike most people on the far left, he actually recognizes that the far left can go too far and takes pretty strong stances against it. For example, if you aren't aware of this, there was a debate within the far left community on whether or not kink and sexual fetishism should be allowed or displayed at Pride as members of the LGBT community. And like most sane, rational adults, Vaush had what I regard as an unbelievably reasonable take.
Pride should be a celebration of liberation and identity. Okay? Do you have any idea how many people you ostracize by making it a fucking sex thing? Quit making pride, quit making the existence of gay people a sex thing. Isn't that the progressive argument? That teaching kids sexuality isn't the same thing as exposing them to sex? Isn't that the whole argument we make? Kids should go to Pride. It should be a cool thing it should be a block party with cotton candy and tie-dye shirt makers where you use the rainbow colors to make tie-dye shirts. It should be a community fair. If you want a kink thing, go to a private venue.
Now, apparently this take was too hot for certain people on the far left, who have a habit of rationalizing borderline pedophilic behavior, and Vaush had to sit there and atone for his hot take, because apparently exposing leather fetishism to children has something to do with celebrating the historical contributions of the kink community to the LGBT community.
Kinksters have had a huge historical impact in Pride, and I don't think that they should be, just because that some of them are deemed too edgy or whatever for public, the light of public day. Guess what? My parents, I talked about this on my stream, my fucking parents, two of my parents literally believe that being trans is a kink and use that as a reason to threaten my life.
No, so obviously that's fucked up, what you just described, your experience. Right. But from my perspective, I couldn't even call out overtly abusive behavior without getting condemned so hard by the LGBTQ community that I went trending nationally.
Do you think it could have been?
The reason why is the same reason good people got banned from my chat, because they saw two groups. They saw creepy fucking lefties defending creepy fucking shit with kids, and they saw me. And the left hates me more than they hate the former group.
Now, as I'm going to show in this video, the reason that Vaush gets himself in these situations and will continue to find himself in these situations is because at an intellectual level, he's adopted a worldview that is ridiculous in my opinion, but more importantly, incompatible and contradictory to the axioms and normative framework he uses to make his more than reasonable condemnation of what I would regard as sexual degeneracy. But of course, in Vaush's worldview, there's no such thing as sexual degeneracy, because degeneracy is merely a subjective, socially constructed term used to oppress people who don't fit the norm. But it's also a reasonable thing to call people who are trying to justify leather fetishism being exposed to children. So what is Vaush's worldview, and why does he get called a postmodern neo-Marxist by someone who is pretty much as far left as he is? In order to understand that, we have to take a look at the domain of moral philosophy. So what is moral philosophy? Whenever we evaluate whether or not an action or a behavior is said to be right or wrong, moral or immoral, that can only be done through one of two fundamentally opposed worldviews. The first worldview is called moral realism, the belief that there are objective answers to whether or not an action is right or wrong. For example, all religious people are moral realists, because they would say that if you commit a sin, if you commit murder, you are engaging in an act that God deems as immoral, and God is the ultimate objective determiner of what is right and wrong. Now, not all moral realists agree or come to the same conclusions. For example, there are some Christian moral realists who say that being gay is a sin. There are other Christian moral realists who say that God loves everybody and makes them the way they are, and so being gay isn't wrong. And there's some moral realists who aren't religious at all, like Sam Harris, who believes that we can create a moral system solely based on our capacity for rationality.
Now, it's generally understood that questions of morality, questions of good and evil and right and wrong, are questions about which science officially has no opinion. It's often thought that there's no description of the way the world is that can tell us how the world ought to be. But I think this is quite clearly untrue. But values are a certain kind of fact. Okay, they are facts about the well-being of conscious creatures.
Now, technically, you can take a different perspective from moral realism, which is called moral anti-realism, and for the purposes of this video and this video only, I'm going to equate moral anti-realism with the philosophy known as postmodernism. But this view of morality is admittedly something that I think is absolutely ridiculous, and no one who says they believe it actually believes it. But moral anti-realists believe that right and wrong are fundamentally socially constructed ideas that exist only in intersubjective space.
Whereas a moral anti-realist is of the opinion that there's no such thing as an epistemically objective morality. Now, that doesn't mean a moral anti-realist doesn't believe things can or cannot be objectively right or wrong, but they're objectively right or wrong in the framework of an intersubjective set of moral principles. So this is my position, that it's intersubjective.
Part of what the postmodernists have done is that they've pushed away the domain of facts entirely, and they say, well, the only thing is that the only thing that actually exists is this domain of intersubjective agreement. And they
you and I are on the same page with respect to postmodernism.
Right, but you have to give the devil his due as well. They pointed out something, and what they pointed out is that it's not so easy to localize the structure that attributes to facts their value.
So this is a pretty important concept, the idea of intersubjective space and the difficulty of localizing the value attributed to facts. Think of the idea of what it means to be normal, or what a societal norm is. We equate normal with good, right? We don't want to normalize things like racism and bigotry, and we do want to normalize things like men going to therapy. But what constitutes normal is partially subjective, right? What's normal for me and my group of friends, or my community and my culture, is not normal for another group of friends or another culture. And if you push this to its logical conclusion, you can start to see how, well, wait a second, if normal means good, but normal is ultimately subjective, it only exists as an agreement between people of a given community or culture, then there is nothing inherently good about those things we call normal. You can see how this logic is used to deconstruct gender roles, right? We have these ideas that men, because they're bigger and more aggressive than women, should be more likely to go into, physically demanding occupations, and women who are better at nurturing and all that should go into social work. A postmodern or moral anti-realist view of this is that those gender roles are simply the constructs of intersubjective agreement of a patriarchal society in the past, and as moral people today, we can agree that those societal norms and those gender roles should change, and people would be better off for them. And while there is truth to that, if you push this idea to its logical conclusion, then you can say, well, wait a second. Every single concept of good that we have inherited from the past is fundamentally subjective. And maybe the idea that children shouldn't be exposed to sex, well, that too can be called into question, because that's an idea that was inherited in the past. And as you saw with the person criticizing Vaush for being too hard on the people who want to expose children to sex, that's how the slippery slope begins. And make no mistake, we're already a ways down that slippery slope. Now, the only way out of this fundamentally irrational set of ideas is an equally irrational claim. The idea that if only everyone agreed on these subjective values arbitrarily, then we could come up with an objective moral standard.
My position is that there's no way to objectively determine, like in a universal sense, what is right or wrong, but if you arbitrarily decide on several axiomatic principles, like, for example, we should promote human well-being or species well-being, whatever, truth and knowledge are good, we should be considerate, like stuff like that, like stuff we choose. I think when we choose to value those things, we're being subjective. It's just what we feel is right. I don't think those are objective determinations. I think we're choosing to bias ourselves towards those beliefs.
But the obvious problem with this is that we don't just arbitrarily decide and choose to believe certain things. We are born a certain way. We have a nature. We have different personalities. Some people value extroversion, hanging out with people more, and some people value being on their own. So it's not a matter of arbitrarily choosing things. And what's more, that poses the problem of, well, what do we do with people who don't choose the same first principles as us? How do we convince them? How do we deal with them? And as you could imagine, the only logical response if you adopt this moral framework is, how do you say, questionable?
I like the world that I live in, by the way. Everything that I advocate for is derived entirely from my completely subjective opinions about how the world should be. And if anyone disagrees with those opinions, I can just ignore them or call them an idiot. Then how would you even convince people who disagreed with you? If they had different axioms, if they had different first principles, how could you ever change their mind? And I said, you couldn't. You'd have to kill them.
And here is where the full-fledged postmodern neo-Marxism manifests itself. Because obviously Vaush is not out to kill people, and he genuinely wants to convince people, which is why he does the streams and why he makes the arguments in the way that he does. And oftentimes they're very effective, and I've certainly changed my perspectives because of his arguments. But if you adopt or claim to adopt this postmodern anti-realist framework where everything is subjective and there's no anchor on which we can truly say this is right or this is wrong or this is good or this is bad, then you have to sneak back in some sort of anchor, and the way that the postmodern neo-Marxists do that is by bringing Marxism back in. And today's neo-Marxism is fundamentally taking the idea of dominant and subordinate relationships between class and expanding it to every branch of society. Whether that's between races or between genders, the idea that all hierarchies, all normative structures in society are fundamentally predicated on power.
There are lines of postmodernist thinking that appear to imply that everything is interpretation. And that's part of the skepticism. Everything's interpretation. But then what that leads the practitioners of those interpretive theories to conclude is, well, back to power. Because they sneak this grand narrative back in that way. And as far as I'm concerned, that's just a new justification for old Marxist presuppositions.
Every hierarchy degenerates into power? What do you say? What is a hierarchy if not power? What are you talking about?
But the contradictions continue to pile up because if you're really a postmodernist who is skeptical of grand narratives, you should be skeptical of Marxism. And you shouldn't accept that, for example, alienation of labor is bad in and of itself. But if you want to use the Marxist arguments while still operating in a postmodern framework, you, again, become a postmodern neo-Marxist. The
point of what I'm making is that the Marxist critique is a meta-narrative, right? So, like, Marxism in and of itself is as a political critique of society, which is to show that the material, conflictions between classes are wrong, that the individual existing in the workplace, which is being alienated, it's wrong. That's like the fundamental point about it, like that alienation is in and of itself bad, and he's making an ethical claim. And so as an anti-realist, if you're going to say that like none of this exists and you enter like postmodernism, you legit become like a postmodern neo-Marxist.
And while I think there are actually a lot of good ideas in Marxism, there are very few good ideas in postmodernism and moral anti-realism. Because if you believe that the concept of good or normal is completely subjective and therefore doesn't actually mean anything, you can't use those words when you're trying to make an argument, even if the argument you're making is correct and logical by any rational person's standard.
What I'm saying is that your position in relation to using words like good, bad, right, and wrong in terms of like creating a system in which you try and evaluate judgments is ultimately impossible if you accept moral anti-realism.
I'm just saying the sex, the obvious nudity, and the obvious kink. Just stop. Be normal, okay? Be gay, which is normal. Be trans or whatever, which is normal, okay? Don't be a fucking weird public, this is my sex event and all of you are subservient to me. The creepy dude, guy, person. Okay?
The psychoanalyst Carl Jung, of whom this channel is in part named after, stated that the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. That is to say, when the individual remains undivided and does not become conscious of his inner opposite, the world must perforce act out the conflict. In other words, if you embody a worldview that is inherently paradoxical and contradictory to reality, like postmodern neo-Marxism, then you will inevitably find yourself defending things you don't believe, trying to make arguments that are inconsistent and invalid by your own standards for things that you do believe. And in Vaush's case, if he does not reject this postmodern neo-Marxist ideology, then he will inevitably be condemned to inconsistency, and when he is called out on his arguments, he will have nothing to say but,
I'm not a philosopher. I never claimed to have a perfectly consistent axiomatic position on all issues.
And so, Vaush, if you see this, I just want to say, genuinely, good luck and Godspeed.